A couple more questions from the chat yesterday, from the forum. And I'm not going to be able to get to all those questions. I'm going to try to get to some of them this afternoon, but yeah, I do my best. So another question around kind of supports for bringing practice into daily life. In my daily routine, I dedicate 1 to 2 hours to practice, depending on the demands of my day. I'm seeking advice on an ideal morning or evening routine to provide support for my daily life awareness practice during the day. Should it involve samatha meditation, listening to Dharma talks, receptive awareness practice, or something entirely different? So this is going to be different for different people. And so, kind of what I said around the noticing what's supportive for you in dropping in questions in the meditation, a lot of what we do here is take responsibility for our own practice. What supports you? What supports you to bring awareness more into daily life? Now, you may want to experiment a little bit. I mean, I think I said at the beginning of this retreat, I encouraged you for this week to play with the open awareness practice in your sitting practice, because it would support the capacity to learn how to be aware in a more formal way, without directing or aiming the attention, would support you to carry that into daily life. So, I mean, that may be something that you want to play with in your, 1 to 2 hours of practice, at least some chunk of that being an open awareness practice to really get familiar with what it means to recognize being aware, and what it means to just notice moment after moment the attention moving from one experience to another. Because if we're using only a focused awareness practice, there's a lot of habits that are cultivated there that are and we're not really practicing with the attentional shift and all the other stuff that comes up around it. So it's just giving you an opportunity to practice with those things in your formal sitting. And then it may be for some that after you kind of get more of a sense of that, and I hear from quite a few people that they say, I use this practice in my daily life, and I do a samatha practice on my cushion. And, that can be just what supports people. It creates a stability of calmness, the samatha practice, that then allows you to be more receptive to what is going on in the day. So there's different kind of different minds are very different. And so you need to look at what supports you. And I would say a little bit of experimentation, but I would say not day-to-day experimentation, because, one day of practicing open awareness is probably not going to give you a sense of what it means to really cultivate that capacity in your sitting practice. So you might try for a month or two a particular routine and kind of get a sense of what happens for you in your day with that routine. And then, maybe bring in some other tools or other things in your formal practice time. All of the things you mentioned, listening to Dharma talks, the reflective practice, which I offered yesterday afternoon, all of these things can be supports for our daily life practice. It's just a matter of seeing what supports you and what supports you in the conditions that you're in at the moment. So there's not one answer for this question, but I would say to be curious about what's supportive. And again, supportive means what creates the conditions for more mindfulness. A couple questions about attitude. I think I heard you say, what is the attitude or perspective, a few times in the morning's guiding meditations. Was yesterday. If you did, could you please elaborate? I'm intrigued by perspective and feel like attitude, with which I've struggled, became clearer. Can you say more about attitude and perspective? Yesterday, I brought in perspective as an alternative word for attitude. Sometimes I use different words. I mean, perspective, I use perspective because often an attitude is, it's how we're looking at experience, right? That's another way to frame attitude, is how am I with experience? That's another different language you can use. Another language that you can use is relationship. What's the relationship I'm having to the experience? So different language can resonate with people in different ways. And I often use a lot of different language just for this very reason. As this person mentioned, perspective made things seem clearer. So it is the attitude, that it is, when it's behind the scenes, it's a perspective of how we're meeting experience. It's maybe a perspective of frustration is being brought to experience, or it's a perspective of curiosity that's being brought to experience. So the attitude can be both wholesome or unwholesome. The perspective can be wholesome or unwholesome. So the curiosity about what's the perspective, that may be a way to kind of be curious about what's going on in the background. What's the filter? That's another language I sometimes use. What's the filter I'm looking through? And sometimes the filter is, very clear. Sometimes it's a filter of clarity, and sometimes it's a filter of fog and dullness and resistance. So yeah, noticing in different language can be helpful to, so using the language that works for you. I find, especially in your use of language to support yourself in the practice, I've been talking about using questions, using wisdom reflections. So this might be a shift for you. Instead of what's the attitude, what's the perspective? That might be more evocative for you of what's going on in the mind. And then a question about a specific attitude. The attitude of regret is in both camps of greed and aversion. Well, I'd include delusion as well. It's got all of them in there. And so speaking to that, can I speak to the fact that, some attitudes seem to be in multiple camps? And I'd say it's interesting to notice this, that the flavor of an attitude can have different threads to it. It's not just one thing. And it's useful to begin to understand the difference there. What is the part of the attitude that's drawing you towards something, which is the greed part? I think it's useful to begin to be clear about what the aspects of greed, aversion, and delusion do. So greed tends to draw us to something. Aversion tends to want to separate us from something. You could say these are the functions of greed and aversion. And delusion tends to obfuscate. It tends to make things not so, or a view is often a perspective or a belief that's not necessarily experienced as greed or aversion. It's just experienced as what we're taking to be true in the moment, where it's like, for instance, the idea that, I used this the other day, the idea that sleepiness is not appropriate with meditation. That idea that I can't be mindful while I'm sleepy. That's an idea, it's a belief. And that is a perspective that shapes what happens. So that perspective, which is, it's not itself, the perspective itself doesn't have the flavor of wanting to meet something or push something away. It's just an idea. It's a belief that thinks it's true. The belief itself that's what's shaping how we relate to experience. But the belief itself doesn't feel like a greed or aversion. It just feels like something that's true. Now, when that belief meets experience, it shapes an aversion to sleepiness and a desire to get away from it. So, that belief itself is not greed or aversion, but it shapes greed or aversion, depending on what is arising in our experience. And so it's useful to begin to get curious about what's the flavor of the mind in terms of how it's moving. Is it moving towards something? Is it wanting to move away from something? Does it just have an idea about something? So those three are the flavors of greed, aversion, and delusion, I would say. And so with regret, different people, I think, and at different times, I've experienced these flavors. Regret, looking to what has happened. There can be both an aversion to something that I did, an aversion to what I said or did. That's kind of in the flavor of regret, and a wishing or a greed, a wishing that I had done something otherwise. So that kind of, what are you being pulled towards? The idea that I should have done something different, and I shouldn't have done that thing. Where's the pull and push? That's a piece to be curious about in looking at attitudes that feel like, or any mind state that feels like it's got components of both. One friend of mine at one point said he thought that greed and aversion were like very much the same thing, because when he had aversion to something, what he did was like, I don't like this thing, let me go to something else. So, like his movement of aversion was to go towards something else. So he felt like that, that meant they were intricately intertwined. And for some people, they are very connected. That an aversive mind state, tends to create the conditions to gravitate us. Well, let's not be with that. Let's go to something pleasant. So that may be how your mind relates to aversion. And I said to him, actually, that's not my experience with aversion, because I tend to be more purely an aversive type and don't have a lot of greed in my mind. And so my movement was more like, I would notice that I would get stuck to something trying to get rid of it. It's like, not this was what my mind said. And that's the wanting to separate. The idea that my mind had about aversion was separation is what will make me happy. It didn't matter what else arose. It's like, not this. So and he actually said, well, that was really helpful. A couple of days later, he came back to me and said, that was helpful because I could see, there's a separation from the thing I don't like, and then the pull to the thing I do like. So there's both the aversion, and that's one piece, the separation piece, and then the movement toward is the greed. So some curiosity about what are the beliefs in there, what's the movement towards, what's the movement away. Just curiosity about all of that. I wouldn't make a big project out of trying to tease it all apart and distinguish it. But these are just things that I've noticed around how greed and aversion and delusion work. And yes, they're going to be intertwined. It's not like, with many of our experiences, there's flavors of not liking something and wanting something else to be true.